Could a rock icon have walked out of his own funeral? For decades, fans have quietly wondered whether the body in that closed coffin was ever really the man they worshipped. The answer, it turns out, sits inside a death certificate filed in Paris, one that almost nobody has ever actually read closely. Paris, July 3, 1971. Inside a rented apartment at 17 Rue Beautrees, Jim Morrison, frontman of The Doors, was found dead in a bathtub. The official story that reached the public was simple and unremarkable: heart failure, a quiet and almost peaceful end for a man whose stage persona had been anything but quiet. But look closer at how that conclusion was actually reached, and the story starts to wobble almost immediately. No autopsy was ever performed. Not a partial one, not a delayed one, none at all. For a death this famous, doesn't that detail alone feel strange? Under French law at the time, this gap wasn't actually illegal. If a death was classified as natural causes, an autopsy simply wasn't required, and officials had no legal obligation to order one just because the deceased happened to be internationally famous. That single legal technicality is the hinge on which an enormous amount of speculation still turns today. No police officer and no forensic doctor ever laid eyes on Morrison's body before it was placed into its coffin. The entire chain of confirmation rested on the word of people who were emotionally involved, not on independent medical authority. When Bill Siddons, the band's manager, received a phone call at 9 in the morning from Morrison's girlfriend Pamela Courson, he didn't initially believe what he was being told. He caught a flight, arrived at the apartment on Rue Beautreillis, and stepped into the bathroom where the body lay in the tub. By his own account, he was too shaken to actually examine what he was looking at closely. He simply did what Pamela asked and called the police, following her lead rather than his own judgment. A death this significant, and the closest thing to an official witness was a grieving, frightened manager who admits he barely looked. So who, in the end, can actually say with total certainty what really happened in that bathroom? Pamela Courson was the only person present in that apartment. Not a roommate, not a friend passing through, not a hotel employee, just her, alone with Morrison, in the hours surrounding his death. She was the one who found the body, and she was the one who made the very first phone call, not to the police, but to Bill Siddons. Doesn't it seem strange that the person closest to the world's biggest rock star, in his final moments, made her first call to a manager rather than emergency services? Then there's the timeline itself. Investigators and biographers have pointed to a gap of nearly 3 hours between the moment Morrison is believed to have died and the moment French medical personnel were actually summoned to the scene. A delay well outside what standard emergency procedure would call typical. Siddons himself added another unsettling detail. When he finally looked at the body in the tub, he saw no blood and no sign of vomiting. Details that don't line up neatly with the kind of overdose scenario so often assumed in the popular retelling of Morrison's death. Biographers who've spent years combing through witness statements from that night keep running into small, nagging inconsistencies, conflicting accounts of when a bath was drawn, when alcohol was purchased, when specific phone calls were actually placed. None of these details are individually damning, but stacked together, they form what investigators studying cover-ups often call an imperfect timeline. The kind of small, scattered contradictions that tend to surface not when someone is lying outright, but when a story is being managed rather than simply told. And there's one more detail that deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. Pamela Courson never appeared before any formal inquiry, never gave testimony to police, never faced a single official question about that night. 3 years later, in 1974, she died of a drug overdose herself, taking whatever she actually knew or didn't know permanently with her. Within hours of Morrison being declared dead, his coffin was sealed and nailed shut at Pamela Courson's explicit request. Her reasoning, according to those close to the situation, was that she feared journalists would try to get a look at the body, a plausible enough concern for a public figure of Morrison's stature, but one that also happened to close off any further scrutiny before it could even begin. Picture the scene for a moment. A global superstar, dead under mysterious enough circumstances, and the coffin closing almost before the shock had time to set in. Here's a detail that should stop you in your tracks. Not a single other member of The Doors travelled to Paris to identify the body. Not the drummer, not the keyboardist, not the guitarist. The rest of the band received their confirmation of Morrison's death over the telephone, relayed second-hand through Bill Siddons, the same manager who admitted he could barely bring himself to look closely at what was in that bathtub. Is it really plausible that one of the most recognizable musicians on the planet was buried without a single bandmate ever laying eyes on the body? A medical report filed in Paris that same year stated there were no signs of external injury on Morrison's body, a finding that ruled out obvious violence, but left the door wide open for an undetermined overdose, or for almost any other quiet explanation. And no police officer and no official forensic examiner ever personally viewed the body before it went into that coffin, according to Siddon's own account of events. Which raises the uncomfortable question this entire case keeps circling back to. If almost nobody who actually knew Morrison ever confirmed what was inside that box, how certain can anyone really be about who, or what, was actually buried? Morrison was laid to rest at Père Lachaise, one of the most famous cemeteries in the world. A rare honour for a foreign citizen to be buried among a site so deeply woven into French cultural memory. For years afterward, though, his grave carried no name at all. No headstone, no marker, nothing to distinguish it from the resting places around it. Doesn't that seem like an odd way to bury one of the most famous musicians alive? It wasn't until 1983, more than a decade later, that a small marker bearing his name was finally installed, and even then, only after repeated incidents of vandalism forced the cemetery's hand. Despite that long stretch of anonymity, the grave has become one of the most visited spots at Père Lachaise, drawing crowds on par with the resting places of Frédéric Chopin and Oscar Wilde. More than 4 million visitors pass through the cemetery every year, and Morrison's plot consistently ranks among the top 3 destinations, according to figures from the Paris Tourist Office. The devotion eventually got so intense that cemetery management had to install security cameras and fencing around the site, after years of fans leaving graffiti, attempting to dig near the grave, or simply damaging the surrounding area out of sheer obsession. Think about the strangeness of that for a second. Millions of people, year after year, making a pilgrimage to a grave that spent over a decade with no name attached to it at all, a grave that nobody outside a tiny circle ever actually confirmed the contents of. Decades later, a former security worker named Sam Burnett dropped a bombshell claim. He stated that he had personally witnessed Morrison die of a heroin overdose in the bathroom of the Rock and Roll Circus nightclub that same night, and that club owners and managers quietly arranged to move the body elsewhere to protect Morrison's public image. If true, that account would upend virtually everything the public has believed for 50 years. Burnett's claim directly contradicts both the official French police account and Pamela Courson's own version of events, yet nobody has ever been able to definitively disprove it either, precisely because no independent medical evidence exists to settle the question either way. Reputable French media outlets have over the years tallied at least 5 competing explanations circulating for Morrison's death: natural heart failure, a heroin overdose at the nightclub, a fatal mix of alcohol and sedatives, a deliberate cover-up orchestrated to hide drug use, and even an accidental death caused by his own girlfriend during an argument. Rumours that Morrison faked his own death gained the most traction in the late 1980s, when several people came forward claiming to have spotted him at a bar in Oregon, and separately at a gas station in Belgium, sightings that were never independently verified by anyone. Robbie Krieger, the band's guitarist, later wrote in his memoir that he genuinely believes Morrison might still be alive somewhere, admitting he has no actual proof, just a persistent gut feeling that refuses to go away. And that's really the core problem with this entire case. There is no piece of medical evidence solid enough to definitively confirm any one of these theories or to rule any of them out. 2 years before his death, Morrison was convicted for indecent exposure following a chaotic concert in Miami, a legal ordeal that followed him for the rest of his life and reportedly played a role in his decision to relocate to Paris, partly to escape the relentless media attention and looming legal troubles back home. That kind of pressure doesn't just disappear because someone crosses an ocean. At the time of his death, Morrison reportedly had a tentative new recording arrangement in discussion with Columbia Records, a detail that fueled speculation he was actively trying to break away from the Doors and reinvent himself entirely, rather than continue on the path that had made him famous. Add to that a detail rarely mentioned in the mythology. Morrison suffered from severe nearsightedness, to the point of barely being able to see without glasses, yet he reportedly refused to wear them in public, a small, human vulnerability tucked beneath the image of an untouchable rock god. There's also a real gap between the self-destructive idol narrative the media love to tell and what the surviving footage actually shows. Recordings of his final performances in Paris during 1969 and 1970 show no documented instances of him appearing visibly drunk or causing disturbances on stage, contradicting the destructive icons image so often attached to his name. And perhaps the most quietly revealing detail of all, his official death certificate, filed in Paris on July 6, 1971, listed his profession not as musician but as poet, a small clerical choice that says a great deal about how he may have actually wanted to be remembered. At this point, it's worth stepping back and asking a bigger question. How do you actually evaluate a decades-old mystery like this one for yourself, rather than simply picking whichever version feels most compelling? Journalists and fact-checkers rely on a fairly consistent method for this kind of work, and it applies just as well here as it does to breaking news. Step 1 is tracking down the original source of a claim, rather than relying on second-hand retellings. In this case, that means the actual 1971 French police report, rather than decades of paraphrased summaries. Step 2 involves comparing testimony from multiple independent witnesses against each other, looking at where accounts from people like Bill Siddons, Sam Burnett, and hotel staff line up, and where they quietly diverge. Step 3 means scrutinizing the timeline itself, checking whether the sequence of events that night actually holds together logically, or whether it only seems to make sense because nobody has looked closely enough. Step 4 is searching out whatever official documentation genuinely exists, a death certificate, court records, any surviving forensic notes, rather than treating rumour and repetition as a substitute for paperwork. Here's a detail that makes this case especially resistant to any of these methods. The investigation into Morrison's death was never formally closed by French authorities. The file reportedly still sits in an archive in Paris's 4th arrondissement, unpublished and effectively frozen in time. No photographs of the body or the scene were ever released publicly, an unusual departure from how comparable cases were typically handled in Paris during that same period. Apply this exact framework to Morrison's case, and you start to understand precisely why it has remained unresolved for more than 50 years. Nearly every step of the standard verification process runs into a wall of missing documentation, unavailable evidence, or witnesses who were never formally questioned in the first place. Whatever actually happened in that Paris apartment, the commercial and cultural afterlife of Jim Morrison has been staggering. The Doors have sold more than 100 million albums worldwide, according to figures compiled by the IIA, placing Morrison among the most enduringly influential recording artists of the entire 20th century. Much of that lasting fascination traces back to a single book. No One Here Gets Out Alive, the 1980 biography by Jerry Hopkins and Danny Sugarman, which became a surprise bestseller nearly a decade after Morrison's death and single-handedly reignited a wave of fan interest, cementing his transformation from musician into full-blown cultural symbol. That transformation eventually earned its own name. Cultural commentators now refer to the Morrison effect, the phenomenon in which an artist becomes more famous and more mythologized after death than they ever were in life, driven largely by public fascination with the ambiguous circumstances surrounding their passing. Researchers at Harvard's music department went so far as to analyze more than 200 Doors songs and found that themes of death and escape appeared in roughly 35% of them. A striking statistic suggesting Morrison's fixation with endings wasn't just a posthumous narrative imposed on him, but something baked into his art all along. Somewhere in that gap between the flawed, nearsighted, legally embattled human being and the leather-clad icon frozen on posters worldwide, the real Jim Morrison quietly disappeared. Perhaps that's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. It may be precisely the unresolved mystery, not the man himself, that made him immortal in the first place. Marianne Faithfull, a fellow musician who was reportedly connected to Morrison in his final period, later flatly rejected the natural causes explanation in her own memoir, insisting that he didn't die from a failing heart, but from a heart that had simply broken. It's a poetic line, but it's also a direct, public contradiction of the official record, coming from someone who claimed to have been close to him. A man named Will Carr, associated with an American cultural centre in Paris, once claimed he had personally been teaching Morrison French in the weeks leading up to his death, a claim nobody was ever able to independently verify, one way or the other. Meanwhile, Morrison's own family reportedly never requested a second investigation or DNA testing, despite having more than enough financial means to pursue one, according to biographer Dylan Jones. Doesn't that quiet, decades-long non-action tell its own kind of story? So many open questions remain officially unanswered. The sealed archive in Paris, the missing photographs, the witnesses never formally questioned. And through it all, Robbie Krieger's words linger, the same sentiment he shared in his own memoir. No real proof, just a persistent feeling that his old bandmate might still be out there somewhere. Perhaps that's the most honest place this story can end. Not with a solved case, but with the quiet realization that sometimes the truth isn't found in the answer at all. It's found in the question that refuses to stop being asked. We started with a question: could a legend have walked out of his own funeral? 50 years later, nobody can answer that with total certainty, and that in itself might be the strangest part of this entire story. Here is the final paradox worth sitting with. A grave that may not even contain the person everyone assumes it does has still become one of the most visited resting places on Earth, drawing millions of pilgrims who come to mourn a man they can't be entirely sure is actually there. A former stage manager once recalled Morrison admitting he sometimes wanted to simply vanish, to fake his own death if the pressure ever became unbearable. Whether that offhand comment was prophecy, coincidence, or nothing at all, nobody can say for certain. Maybe not knowing the full truth is exactly what preserved the legend in the first place. A mystery this durable functions almost like a mirror. Each fan who stands at that grave in Paris ends up seeing back whatever version of Jim Morrison they already wanted to believe in. A 2014 survey on rock fandom found that 27% of American rock fans believe Morrison didn't actually die that night in 1971, a striking number, though still smaller than the 31% who say the same about Elvis Presley. So here's where we leave it, deliberately unresolved. A sealed coffin, an unmarked grave that took 12 years to get a name, and a case file still sitting untouched in a French archive. Which theory do you believe? And does it even matter, when the mystery itself has already outlived every possible answer?